An elderly woman feeds a stray dog every day. One day, the dog leads her to a shocking discovery. Greetings from Heart Story HQ. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We hope you enjoy the story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Margaret stood at the edge of the trees, her breath uneven, her old hands gripping the folds of her sweater as if holding herself together. The air was still, too still. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto the ground before her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Rusty, the stray she had fed every day without fail, stood beside her, his ears pinned back, his body tense. He let out a low whimper, nudging her leg, urging her forward. But Margaret couldn't move. Just minutes ago, she had been in her kitchen, pouring warm broth into Rusty's bowl, expecting another quiet evening on her front porch, another day just like all the others. She never imagined that tonight, of all nights, Rusty wouldn't touch his food, that he would stare at her with an urgency she had never seen before, that he would bark. And yet, there was something about the way Rusty had looked at her. So she had followed. She had stepped past her fence for the first time in years, her boots crunching against the damp earth as Rusty led her deeper and deeper into the woods. The towering trees swallowed the last of the evening light, shadows stretching longer, reaching out. The air had grown colder with each step, but still, she followed. And now, she was here, standing at the edge of something she was never meant to see. Her heart pounded, her pulse a frantic drum in her ears. Rusty whined again, his body pressed against her leg, but Margaret barely noticed, because there, just beyond the tangled roots and fallen branches, lay something that should have never been hidden, something that changed everything. She wanted to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen it, but it was too late. Rusty had led her here for a reason, and there was no going back. What had she found, and why had the dog chosen her? Stay with me, because once you see what Margaret saw, you'll never forget it. Hi everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'm hoping you can help us out with something. We're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of February, and subscribing to the channel is the best way to help us get there. We really appreciate your support. Margaret Reynolds had spent the last 10 years in quiet solitude. At 76, life had slowed down to a predictable rhythm, the days blurring together like pages in an old, forgotten book. She lived in a small house at the very edge of town, where the roads turned to gravel and the streetlights gave way to open fields. The house had been hers and William's, a home they had built together, brick by brick, memory by memory. But after he passed, the house had become something else. Every morning, Margaret followed the same routine. She woke with the sunrise, her body moving stiffly but precisely through the motions of habit. She would slip on her old knitted cardigan, the one William had always loved on her, even as its once vibrant colors faded. Then she'd make her way to the kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove, waiting for the familiar hiss of boiling water. She always used the same porcelain teacup, white with blue flowers curling around the rim, the last remnant of a life long gone. And then she would sit by the window. She had long since stopped expecting visitors. The neighbors had once been familiar, but new families had moved in over the years, people she never got around to knowing. The phone rarely rang anymore. The world outside had grown distant, as if it no longer had a place for her. She would sit for hours, watching the world pass her by. The children riding their bicycles down the road, the mailman making his routine stops, the leaves shifting with the changing seasons. It wasn't a bad life, she told herself, just quiet. But then, one afternoon, Rusty appeared. It was a cold October day when she first saw him. Just a shadow at the edge of her yard, barely more than skin and bone. His fur was thick with dirt, his ribs pressing against his sides, his eyes tired but alert. He stood there, watching her, cautious, unmoving. Margaret had hesitated at first. Strays were common in these parts, dogs abandoned or lost, left to fend for themselves. But something about this one felt different. She had stepped back inside, rummaged through her fridge, and found a piece of leftover chicken. Carefully, she placed it just outside the porch and retreated, watching through the window as the dog slowly approached, sniffing the air before devouring the food in seconds. And so it began. The next day, he came back. And the next. Margaret didn't name him at first. Naming things meant attachment, and she wasn't sure if he would stay. But he kept coming. Every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, like clockwork, she started leaving a bowl out for him. sometimes with leftover meat, other times just warm broth poured over rice. Slowly, she noticed the change in him. His ribs weren't as sharp, his fur wasn't as dull, and there was a new light in his eyes. It wasn't long before she began to speak to him. Not that she expected a response, of course. But in the silence of her home, it felt natural. She told him about the weather, about the things she used to do, about William. She even told him about the neighbors she never spoke to, pointing them out as they walked past. Rusty never answered. Margaret had never considered herself a dog person, but Rusty wasn't just any dog. She had spent years keeping the world at arm's length, and yet, somehow, this stray had found his way into her life. What Margaret didn't realize was that Rusty wasn't just any stray. And soon, he would lead her to something that would change her life forever. Margaret had come to know Rusty's habits well. He was a creature of routine, just like her. Every day, at exactly 4 o'clock, he arrived, trotting up the path toward her house with the same eager expression, his tail wagging slightly, ears perked up in anticipation of his meal. He never turned away food, no matter what she put in the bowl. Sometimes it was leftover stew, sometimes boiled chicken, sometimes just warm rice with a bit of broth. He always devoured every bite as if he hadn't eaten in days. Until tonight. Margaret placed the bowl down on the porch like she always did, waiting for the familiar sound of Rusty lapping up his meal. But instead, he just stood there, staring at her. His body was tense, his tail was stiff, his ears twitched toward the woods behind the house. Margaret frowned. "Go on, eat," she urged, nudging the bowl slightly with the toe of her slipper. But Rusty didn't even look at it. Instead, he let out a short, sharp bark. Not the kind of playful bark he sometimes gave when birds landed too close, or when the wind sent leaves skittering across the ground. No, this was different. Urgent. He turned his head toward the trees and barked again. Margaret's stomach tightened. She had lived in this house for over 40 years, and the woods behind it had never once been a place she cared to wander into. The trees were dense, the trails long forgotten, the underbrush thick. Even when she was younger, she had never dared to go too deep. And now, standing at the porch, feeling the chill in the air, she had no intention of going anywhere near them. "Rusty, what's the matter?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of unease creeping into it. The dog let out another bark, then took a few steps toward the woods. Then he turned back, staring at her, waiting. Margaret swallowed. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and she noticed, for the first time, how dark the sky had become. Thick clouds loomed in the distance, creeping in slowly, swallowing the last of the day's light. "Back tonight, Rusty. There's a storm coming." But Rusty didn't move. He barked again, louder this time. Then, before Margaret could protest, he took off, straight into the woods. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Rusty! Rusty, get back here!" The dog didn't listen. She stood frozen, her mind racing. She wasn't a young woman anymore. She didn't run after things. She had spent too many years being careful, knowing her limits, staying inside where it was safe. But something about the way Rusty had looked at her, the urgency in his bark, she couldn't shake it. The wind picked up again, rattling the porch railing. A storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones. "I shouldn't do this," she muttered under her breath. And yet, she stepped back into the house, grabbed the old flashlight from the drawer by the door, and wrapped her cardigan tightly around herself. With one last deep breath, she stepped off the porch and into the trees. The moment she entered the woods, everything changed. The air was colder here, damp with the coming storm. The towering trees blocked what little light remained, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. Margaret moved carefully, her boots crunching against the dry leaves, her flashlight flickering as she swept it from side to side. "Rusty," she called. Her voice sounded too small, swallowed by the endless expanse of trees. Nothing. No barking, no movement, just the sound of the wind whispering through the branches above. She took another step forward, her heart beating faster. Why had she done this? She should have stayed inside, let the dog come back on his own. What if she got lost? What if she fell? Just as she was about to turn back, a sound, a rustling. Margaret snapped her head toward the noise, her flashlight catching the briefest glimpse of movement between the trees. A shape, low to the ground, fast. Rusty. He was running, but not toward her. He was going deeper. "Rusty, stop!" She hurried after him as best as her tired legs would allow, gripping onto tree trunks to steady herself. The terrain grew rougher, branches clawing at her sweater, roots threatening to trip her. The deeper she went, the more unsettling everything became. She hadn't realized how wild these woods had grown. She hadn't realized how quiet they were. Something was wrong, and then she saw them. Footprints, not Rusty's, bigger, human, leading into the darkness ahead. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Who had been out here? The prints were fresh, too fresh. The damp earth still held their shape perfectly, untouched by the wind. Her breath caught in her throat. A part of her wanted to turn around, to forget she had ever stepped into these trees, to go back home, lock the door, and pretend she never saw them. But Rusty was still out there, and before she could take another step forward, the flashlight flickered. Then it went out. The world around her fell into blackness. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers trembling as she hit the flashlight against her palm, trying to bring it back to life. Nothing. Stay calm, she whispered to herself. Just turn around and... A crack. Somewhere behind her, like a footstep. Margaret's breath hitched. She wasn't alone. And then, a voice. Faint. Somewhere in the distance. A whisper. Help me. Help me? Her blood turned to ice. The words barely carried through the trees, but she heard them. A voice, fragile and broken, floating through the stillness of the forest. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. Rusty had led her here. But to what? The storm rumbled in the distance, the wind howling through the trees. Margaret stood frozen in the dark, heart hammering in her chest, as the voice came again. Please, help me. She had a choice. Turn back or step forward. And deep down, she already knew what she was going to do. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, took a slow breath, and followed the voice into the darkness. Margaret's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she clutched the dead flashlight in her trembling hands. The voice had gone silent. The only sound now was the wind moving through the trees, its eerie whisper curling through the branches above her. She wasn't sure how far she had wandered. The house felt a lifetime away. She turned in slow circles, her heart pounding in her chest. Rusty? The dog had led her here, dragged her deep into the woods, but now he was nowhere to be seen. And then a rustling sound. Not the wind, not Rusty, something else. Margaret's skin prickled with unease. She turned sharply, her useless flashlight clutched like a weapon in her frail fingers. The darkness shifted around her. Then, in a brief flash of moonlight breaking through the canopy, something caught her eye, something metallic. She narrowed her gaze. What was that? Carefully, she moved closer, her feet unsteady against the uneven ground. With every step, the shape became clearer. A dull silver glint, half buried beneath layers of dirt and overgrown roots. Margaret knelt, her old bones protesting as she brushed away the loose earth with shaking hands. What she uncovered made her breath hitch. A rusted metal door. It was large, rectangular and heavy. Its surface corroded with time. An old storm shelter, maybe? But why was it hidden so deep in the woods, far from any home or farmland? Margaret ran her fingers along the handle, flaking rust crumbling beneath her touch. Something about this felt wrong. Very, very wrong. And then, Rusty reappeared. He came bounding out of the darkness, his paws kicking up dirt as he skidded to a stop in front of the door. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff, his entire body vibrating with urgency. And then, he began to scratch at it. "Rusty, stop!" The dog ignored her. His paws scraped against the metal frantically, his breath coming in sharp, desperate pants. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. What is this place? The voice, the faint, broken whisper from before echoed in her mind. Help me. She swallowed hard, pressing a hand against her chest. She had a choice: walk away. Forget she had ever seen this, pretend none of it had happened. Go back to the safety of her quiet house, her routine, her porch, her tea. Or she could open it and find out what lay beneath. Rusty let out a low whimper, his dark eyes pleading with her. Margaret exhaled a shaky breath, her fingers stiff with age wrapped around the cold, rusted handle. She pulled. At first, the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck. Years of dirt and neglect sealing it shut. But Margaret gritted her teeth and yanked harder. With a sickening screech, the door finally gave way. A deep, hollow groan echoed beneath her as it creaked open, the hinges shrieking against the silence. And then, darkness. An underground tunnel. The smell hit her first. Damp, stale, rotting. The air was thick, heavy with something that made her stomach turn. Rusty didn't hesitate. With a sharp bark, he bolted inside. Margaret's heart lurched. No! Rusty, wait! The deeper they went, the narrower the passage became. The wooden beams creaked as if the whole thing might collapse at any moment. Margaret's heart pounded. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking when she saw it. A small, makeshift room. She froze. Her flashlight beam wavered, illuminating the space before her. A tattered blanket lay crumpled on the ground, dirt-stained and ragged at the edges. Beside it, an empty can of food, rusted and covered in dust. Margaret swallowed hard. Someone had lived here. Someone had been trapped here. Her hands trembled as she took another step forward. That was when she saw it, the thing that made her breath hitch in her throat. A notebook, but he was gone. Her breath came quick now. She stared down into the gaping void below her, into the blackness that swallowed the light whole. There was no telling what was down there, no telling what she was about to step into. But there was one thing she did know. Rusty had never left her behind, and she wouldn't leave him behind either. So Margaret took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The moment Margaret stepped inside the tunnel, she felt it. A deep, unsettling wrongness that wrapped around her like cold, damp fingers. Her breath turned shallow. The air was thick, heavy with something old, something forgotten. The scent of mildew clung to the wooden beams that barely held up the walls. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, dirt shifting beneath her weight as she slowly made her way forward. Her flashlight flickered, shadows danced across the walls, twisting and shifting with every step she took. Rusty was ahead of her, moving with purpose, his tail low, his ears alert. He had stopped barking, now he just let out soft whimpers, his nails clicking against the cold earth. It lay half buried under a layer of dust, its once white pages yellowed with age. The edges were curled, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still visible. Margaret bent down, her fingers brushing against the cover. Slowly, hesitantly, she picked it up and flipped it open. The first page was covered in shaky, uneven handwriting. If someone finds this, please, please don't forget me. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She turned the next page, then the next. Letter after letter, the words scrawled in desperation, in hope, in fading strength. I don't know how long I've been down here. I hear footsteps at night, but no one comes for me. I think he's coming back soon. I have to hide this before he does. Margaret's vision blurred. The name signed at the bottom of each letter was familiar, too familiar. Her hands shook as she whispered it aloud. Claire Jacobs, the missing girl, the one from 20 years ago. The news had covered it for months. How the young girl had disappeared walking home from school. How the whole town had searched for her. How they never found a trace. But Margaret remembered more than just the headlines. She remembered the posters plastered across every telephone pole. She remembered the candlelight vigils, the pleas from a broken family desperate for answers. She remembered watching the mother cry on the news, begging anyone to come forward with information. And then, just like that, the world had moved on. Margaret clutched the notebook to her chest. She hadn't moved on. She had spent years alone, staring out the window, watching life pass her by. And all this time, just beyond the trees, just beneath the ground, this had been here. Rusty let out a low, anxious whine. Margaret turned to see him standing at the end of the passageway. The tunnel didn't stop here. There was more. Margaret forced herself to move, following Rusty deeper, gripping the notebook like a lifeline. Then, at the very end of the passage, she saw it. A wooden door. It was old, the wood splintering at the edges, a heavy iron lock keeping it sealed. Margaret's breath hitched. She reached out, her frail fingers trembling as they wrapped around the handle. She hesitated. Everything inside her screamed to turn back. But then she thought of the notebook, of the girl who had never been found. Margaret had to know. She took a deep breath and turned the handle. What she found on the other side was far worse than she ever imagined. The moment Margaret turned the handle, a deep shudder ran through her. The old wooden door groaned in protest as it swung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A wave of stale, suffocating air rushed past her, thick with dust, dampness, and something else. Something rotting. Margaret hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rusty whined softly beside her, his body tense, his ears twitching as if waiting for something. Then she heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile, that at first she thought she had imagined it. A shallow breath. Margaret lifted the flashlight with shaking hands, her finger flicking desperately at the switch. The bulb flickered weakly, barely illuminating the small, crumbling room beyond the door. And then she saw her. Curled up in the farthest corner of the room, barely more than a shadow against the dirt-covered floor, was a woman. Her body was frail, draped in tattered clothing that had long since lost its color. Her hair was matted, strands clinging to her pale, sweat-drenched face. Her limbs were curled in on themselves, her body unnaturally still. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She was alive, barely. Rusty let out a low, heart-wrenching whimper and moved toward the woman, pressing his nose against her arm, nudging her gently. The woman stirred. Margaret gasped as she watched her eyelids flutter, her breath coming out in short, shallow pants. For a moment it seemed as if she was struggling to comprehend what was happening. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Dear God, how long has she been down here? Her mind was spinning. Who was she? How had she survived? A rush of adrenaline surged through Margaret's veins, overriding the fear that had paralyzed her moments ago. She stepped forward, crouching down beside the woman, careful not to startle her. Can you hear me? Margaret's voice was softer than a whisper. The woman's eyelids lifted just enough for Margaret to see them. Deep, hollow, haunted. And then she spoke. A single, cracked whisper. Lena. My name is Lena. Margaret's entire body stiffened. Lena Carter. The name sent shockwaves through her. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't. Lena Carter had vanished over 2 decades ago, a name etched into old newspapers, a face plastered across milk cartons long since discarded, a town's tragedy whispered about in hushed tones before it faded from memory. Everyone had assumed she was gone, but she wasn't. She had been down here all this time. Her fingers, bony and shaking, curled around Margaret's with what little strength she had left. Margaret felt her throat tighten, and then Lena whispered something that sent shivers down her spine. Thank you for following him. Her words were barely audible, but Margaret heard them. Lena's sunken eyes flickered toward Rusty, who had settled beside her, his head resting against her leg, as if standing guard. And suddenly it all made sense. Rusty had known. Somehow, some way, he had sensed her. The desperate girl who had clung to life beneath the earth for 20 long years. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks as sirens pierced the night. Within minutes, the woods erupted with flashing red and blue lights. Voices called out as officers and paramedics rushed toward her, their eyes widening at the sight of the woman they had long given up on finding. Margaret stepped back as they carefully lifted Lena's fragile body onto a stretcher. It was finally over. Margaret stood at the edge of the woods, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she watched the ambulance pull away, taking Lena toward the life she never thought she'd have again. The case that had haunted the town for decades was no longer a mystery. Because of Rusty, Margaret looked down at him, the stray dog who had once been just another forgotten soul. The dog who had saved a life. She knelt beside him, pressing a trembling hand against his fur, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. Rusty leaned into her touch, his tail thumping softly against the ground. Come on, boy, Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Let's go home. And this time, as they walked back toward the house, she knew it would never feel empty again. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of machines and the muffled voices of nurses in the hallway. Sunlight filtered through the thin white curtains, casting a soft glow on Lena's fragile face. Margaret sat beside her bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. It had been days since that night, days since she had followed Rusty into the woods, since she had opened that door, since she had found her. Lena had been barely clinging to life, but she was alive. Now she lay there, weak but recovering. A nurse had carefully brushed her tangled hair, revealing a woman who had aged in suffering but not in spirit. Margaret hesitated before reaching forward, placing her hand over Lena's. The younger woman's eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me." Margaret swallowed hard, shaking her head. "No, sweetheart, he did." She turned toward the foot of the bed, where Rusty sat obediently, his eyes never leaving Lena's face. She let out a soft, breathless chuckle. "The dog?" Margaret nodded, her throat tightening. "He never gave up on you." A tear slipped down Lena's cheek, and for the first time since being found, she smiled. Reuniting with family, it didn't take long for the news to spread. Lena Carter, the girl who had vanished over 20 years ago, had been found alive. Her family, once shattered by grief, came rushing to the hospital the moment they heard. Margaret watched as Lena's mother collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her as though she might disappear again if she let go. There were no words, only the kind of pain and love that had been frozen in time, now spilling out in broken cries and whispered apologies. Margaret stood back, watching with a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. A family that had been torn apart was whole again, and all because of a stray dog. A hero's recognition days passed. Lena continued to heal, and Margaret went back to her quiet house. Only it wasn't so quiet anymore. Rusty never left her side. He no longer waited at the porch for his evening meal. He was inside now, curled up at her feet, following her from room to room, his loyal brown eyes never straying far. Margaret had never owned a dog before, but it didn't take long to realize she wasn't just his owner, she was his person. One evening, a knock came at her door. Margaret opened it to find the mayor of the town standing there, a handful of reporters behind him, cameras flashing. She blinked. "Mrs. Thompson," the mayor said warmly, "I think the town owes you and your four-legged friend a great deal of thanks." Margaret furrowed her brows. "Oh, I don't." "Nonsense." He stepped aside, motioning to the large crowd gathered at the edge of her property. Neighbors, strangers, police officers, all standing there, waiting to see her. "Because of your kindness, a woman's life was saved, and because of this dog's loyalty, the truth was finally uncovered." Rusty wagged his tail, sensing the shift in energy. The mayor bent down, scratching behind his ears before handing Margaret a plaque. The engraving made her chest tighten. In honor of Margaret Thompson and Rusty, the town's unsung heroes. Applause erupted. Margaret, overcome with emotion, clutched the plaque to her chest as she knelt beside Rusty. "Well, would you look at that, boy?" she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You're famous now." Rusty gave her a sloppy kiss on the cheek. Margaret laughed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. She felt found. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change lives in ways we never expect. Margaret had no idea that feeding a stray dog would lead her to uncover a truth buried for decades. Rusty had no idea that choosing the right person to trust would save someone who had been waiting for a miracle. But in the end, they saved each other. What do you think? Do you believe animals have a sixth sense? Do they understand more than we realize? What would you have done if you were Margaret? Tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more heartwarming stories that remind us, sometimes, the best heroes come in the most unexpected forms.